This may look like a relic from the First World War, a fragile biplane with linen skin and exposed struts. The Fairey Swordfish seems absurd standing beside sleek monoplane fighters. And yet, on the night of 11-12 November 1940, 21 of these slow-moving, ungainly aircraft flew almost 170 miles from HMS Illustrious and attacked the Italian fleet at Taranto. That single night forced naval thinkers to ask a new question. How do you sink a battleship without using a battleship? Britain's answer at Taranto changed the assumptions of naval warfare. If you're intrigued by that contradiction, an apparently obsolete aircraft delivering a modern strategic shock, stay with me. If this is the sort of story that draws you in, please subscribe. There's more on naval aviation and the artifacts that preserve it. Look closely, and the Swordfish is a study in paradox. From a distance, it is a slow, lumbering biplane, two wings stacked, struts and wires forming a delicate cage, and a fuselage covered in fabric that, when wet, gleams almost translucent. It carried the unmistakable lump beneath its belly, an 18-inch torpedo, roughly 3/4 of a ton of iron and explosive, suspended like a stubborn fruit. The cockpit is open, the crew exposed to wind and cold. At cruise speed, the Swordfish barely smeared the horizon. Its top speed was embarrassingly low compared with the fighters of 1940. On paper, it read obsolete. And yet, that same construction, big wings, low wing loading, forgiving stall characteristics, made the Swordfish uniquely suited to certain tasks. It could take off from a short carrier deck, even a stiffer sea state, and it had the slow, steady handling essential for the precise work of laying a torpedo. For a torpedo attack, speed can be an enemy. Judges of aeronautical grace sometimes forget that a slow, stable platform gives you time to set the release, to aim the torpedo toward a narrow window between a net, a boom, or a searchlight beam. Museum curators love the Swordfish for what it embodies, ingenuity layered on apparent inadequacy. You can see the plane in a dim hangar and imagine its skin as paper. The Fleet Air Arm's surviving Swordfish, the last airworthy example, still smells faintly of fabric varnish and oil. In the museum cases alongside the aircraft, there are pieces of the raid's material world, a silk escape map used by a navigator, a compact course and speed calculator with its brass dial worn smooth by fingers in the dark, and a diary torn at the corners and ink-stained where a trembling hand held it. These objects translate a tactical idea into human practice. They remind you that the raid was not a single grand plan executed by machines. It was hours of navigational arithmetic, repeated checklist checks, and tiny acts of courage. To understand why Taranto mattered, you need to look at the Mediterranean as a strategic chessboard. For Britain, the sea lanes through the Mediterranean were lifelines. Supplies and troops bound for North Africa and the Middle East depended on safe passage. Opposing that, the Italian Regia Marina sat concentrated in the shelter of Taranto's harbor, a fleet of capital ships that, if unleashed, could challenge Allied convoys and complicate operations in the eastern Mediterranean. Britain's heavy surface fleet was stretched thin. Battleships are expensive things. You cannot replicate them overnight. Admiral Andrew Cunningham and his colleagues faced a hard reality: how to neutralize a fleet without sacrificing what few capital resources they had. Vice Admiral Lumley Lister and Cunningham grasped a different solution: to think in terms of reach. If you can strike where the enemy thinks itself safe, in harbor, under searchlights and anti-aircraft batteries, you can reshape the balance of naval power without a costly surface engagement. That is the logic behind Operation Judgment, a night carrier-launched torpedo attack into a defended harbor. It sounds simple in summary. The execution was anything but. The operational problem was wickedly complex. Taranto's defenses were not naive. The Italians had nets, patrols, barrage balloons, and a ring of anti-aircraft batteries. Searchlights could pick out an aircraft like a needle and hold it there while shells converged. Torpedoes face their own physics. They need to hit the water at the right height and speed to avoid flipping or burying themselves in a wave. Drop too low and the torpedo smashes into a swell. Too high and the torpedo arcs and breaks. For Swordfish crews, there was no autopilot to rescue a mistake. Navigation had to be dead on. The planning phase leaned heavily on local reconnaissance from Malta. Photographs taken from the island allowed analysts to map anchor positions, defensive booms, and the channel approaches. Naval intelligence made careful lists: which berths held battleships, where the boom nets lay, what the likely arc of anti-aircraft fire would be.
Silk maps were prepared so the pilots and observers could fold them into pockets and consult them without a lamp. Navigators used compact mechanical computers, course and speed calculators, to convert bearings into heading adjustments minute by minute. It was practical, paper-era technology, executed by people who had to do trigonometry with a shaking hand and the horizon barely visible. What the planning could not prepare for was the human strain. The Swordfish crews who flew that night were often young, many of them barely in their 20s. One of them, an observer named John Neal, was 21. His diary, the kind of small, narrow book a man can tuck into a shirt, captures both the procedural brevity of naval logs and the sudden, intimate shock of combat. He wrote later in a line that reads like a line drawn across time, "Touched the surface once."
Short, factual, but it carries an entire night compressed into a single phrase, the plane scraping, a fingertip of fabric and wood kissing the Mediterranean as a torpedo grazed the waves and the world seemed to tilt. And then there are recollections that reach toward the sensory. Alfie Sutton, who flew as an air crewman, described the night in a way that makes the air feel close and cold. In interview, he recalled the tracers. They looked like they were bouncing along the water. Think of that image, lines of fire skipping in parallel to your wings, and you understand how visual chaos can become a fixed point in memory. It's worth pausing on that phrase. A tracer's flash is an ephemeral thing. Described like a stone on a pond, it becomes a line you can almost navigate by. The flotilla that carried the Swordfish into action was itself part of a larger gamble. HMS Illustrious provided the flight deck and the air group. The night of the raid, 21 Swordfish were launched in 2 waves. The aircraft would fly the roughly 170-mile trip across the Mediterranean in darkness, a voyage of small margins. The first challenge was takeoff. A Swordfish laden with a torpedo is heavy, and the carrier deck is short. Pilots needed to time the wind over the deck, the pitch of the carrier, and the alignment with the catwalk and safety wires. Then they climbed into the night. Navigation over open water at night in 1940 was an exercise in disciplined uncertainty. There was no radar guidance for every plane. The crews used dead reckoning and intermittent radio fixes. A typical sortie profile involved plotting an initial course from Illustrious, timing legs against the course and speed calculator, and using recognizable landmarks, faint lights on shore, a lighthouse if one was visible, to confirm position. Silk maps were more than conveniences. In the glare of a searchlight or the blackout of an overcast sky, Silk won out because it didn't crack under the cold and it folded without crumpling into unreadable black. A navigator like John Neal worked in the dim glow from cockpit instruments and a tiny lamp, converting minutes and degrees into headings while flares might be bursting overhead. There is an intimacy to the artifacts that keeps historians honest. A course and speed calculator with a chipped dial reminds you that mistakes could be mechanical as well as human. A torn silk map with coffee stains speaks of hurried plotting. The diaries are perhaps the most human artifacts of all. A logbook entry on board Illustrious might be terse. Officers seldom indulge the kind of sentiment that fills private notebooks, but the little margins hold the story. Later, when crews recounted the night, those margins became the memory's lens. When the Swordfish closed on Taranto, the attack plan hinged on illumination and timing. A pair of flare droppers was assigned to rise over the harbor, casting a cone of light that would make the shipping an easier target for low-flying torpedo aircraft. They were not to blind the harbor indefinitely. The flares had to be placed carefully to avoid turning the attackers into static, glowing prey. The torpedo aircraft approached at roughly 30 feet above the sea, a hairbreadth in aviation terms, because the torpedo's angle and velocity demanded it. At that height, any small error is magnified. The swell or a gust can lift or drop the plane by a matter of feet, and the torpedo might meet water at an improper angle. The Swordfish had another advantage in the approach. Their slow speed meant they presented a different profile to anti-aircraft gunners. Many anti-aircraft systems were calibrated to engage faster aircraft. A slow plane could, perversely, complicate gunnery solutions trained to lead a target. What the Swordfish gained in this idiosyncratic edge, it still risked in sheer exposure. Searchlights, improvised barrage, and the steady rattle of pom-pom guns would make the sky a crossword of light and sound. In sections of the fleet harbor, boom nets awaited, designed precisely to catch a torpedo's path. If those nets held, a torpedo could be deflected, or worse, the attacking aircraft could be forced into an evasive maneuver that would make the release inaccurate. The first wave was briefed with surgical targets, the capital ships at specific berths whose sinking or severe damage would limit the Italian fleet's operational reach. The timing had to be minute perfect because a prolonged illumination could allow defensive adjustments. Pilots and observers rehearsed lines of approach, release points marked on silk maps, and abort procedures if a target proved unsuitable. They also rehearsed small personal rituals to keep fear at bay,
a sip of black tea mixed with chocolate, a whispered prayer, a tightened grip on a worn instrument. For many of these young men, this would be the most intense test of their training, and the only time the arithmetic of navigation would matter in its harshest form. On the flight deck, the atmosphere was taut. Sailors watched the planes form a ragged line against the night. Squadron leaders checked flares, clipped harnesses, and passed final signals. The carrier's captain coordinated with the bridge, wind over deck, speed, and heading, because every knot of wind could be the thin difference between a successful rotation and a stalled start. Then, one by one, the Swordfish haved into the air, their engines coughing into the night, the torpedo a weight, not just of ordnance but of consequence. Crossing that 170-mile stretch in darkness is a peculiar kind of time. Hours compress under the instrument panel. Conversation is terse. Even the engine noise becomes routine, an added metronome to calculations. You consult your clock, check a heading, compare bearings, and adjust.
The navigator, in a small prone nook behind the pilot's seat, or beside him in some versions, keeps the running sum of degrees and minutes, flicking a pencil, murmuring coordinates. Outside, the sea is an immense, indifferent black. The only color that breaks it are the periodic lights of coastal towns, if any are visible, and the occasional flash of another plane's navigation light. Approach to Taranto shifted the night into a different register. Searchlights began to sift the sky. Flare droppers took their station, and a faint, chalky glow washed the harbor. Once the flares bloomed, the complexity increased. Defenders had to choose whether to concentrate fire on visible targets or to protect the most valuable ships. In the log of one observer, a scratchy line filled with the bland prose Navy men favor, there is a notation that signals the controlled chaos. Aircraft were being illuminated, but the pattern of fire was uneven, sometimes sweeping ahead of the attackers, sometimes lagging. In the noise and light, the pilots began their runs. You can build a scene from the fragments the men left behind. John Neal's later diary compresses the sensation into a sentence. Touched the surface once. It's a stark moment of contact. It suggests a wingtip or float skid grazing the Mediterranean as the torpedo releases and the plane tenses over a world of fire. Alfie Sutton's memory supplies the visual complement, tracers bouncing along the water. Those two lines together produce a cinematic image. The plane dangerously close to water, a string of fire dancing beside it, and the sky turned into a grid of light. The first releases were not theatrical. They were precise and ugly. Torpedoes slipped free of racks, cut the air, and hit the water. They had to run straight for a short burn before their gyros steadied them on course. Some torpedoes found their marks. In the confined space of Taranto's eastern harbor, a torpedo that once would have needed a long, open run found the stolid flank of an anchored capital ship. In the tense minutes after impact, oil slicked the surface in black stains, and ships listed as water found ways into compartments where pumps could not contend. The Italians were experienced seamen, and their defenses caused problems. Nets snagged, and some torpedoes failed. But crucially, several heavy units were struck, and more than a few were rendered out of action. Even in victory, there were costs. 2 Swordfish did not return. Their crews were lost to the sea or captured. The balance of risk and reward, so carefully weighed in Admiralty planning rooms, exacted its human toll. On deck back aboard Illustrious, sailors would note the loss on a manifest and keep the tally of aircraft aloft. The immediate signals that came through the chain of command were more muted than the public would later imagine. A message about the number of hits, the condition of particular berths, and a cautious optimism that the operation had achieved its tactical aims. Admiral Cunningham, for his part, wired terse congratulations that acknowledged the daring and advised prudence. Naval officers knew to avoid hyperbole until assessors could count damage from reconnaissance flights at first light. At first light, photographs from reconnaissance aircraft began to tell a clearer story. Ships were listing, some were beached to prevent sinking in deep water, and decks that had been smooth and proud the night before lay mangled and blackened. The damage assessment would count 3 major warships as heavily damaged and temporarily removed from active service. That tally matters. It was not the annihilation of the Regia Marina, but it was a severe, shock-induced reduction in its capacity to challenge Allied sea lanes in the immediate future. If we step back for a moment and think about method rather than moment, Taranto exemplifies a particular kind of military logic, demonstration by doing. The raid did not invent carrier aviation or torpedo tactics. Navies had been experimenting with both for decades.
What Taranto did was to provide a clear case study in which a small, attritable force delivered strategic leverage by striking decisively at an enemy's heart in a defended area. In the arc of doctrine, this is proof of concept with concrete photographic evidence and a human roll call. It's the difference between arguing about theory in the Admiralty and producing a night's worth of photographs that show battleships with decks twisted like tin. That is precisely why Taranto's story reverberated beyond the Mediterranean. Intelligence observers, foreign naval attachés, and even planners in other navies took note. Japanese planners studied the photographs and the after-action accounts as part of their own evolving doctrine. Many later historians would link the Taranto raid to a broader pattern of naval thinking that in time informed the planning behind Pearl Harbor. But it is essential to keep that relationship in proportion. Taranto did not cause other decisions. It influenced them by demonstrating a capability. It was one among several data points that shaped how naval aviation could be used against capital ships. The human side of this event is not reducible to doctrinal shifts or tactical diagrams. The diaries and interviews preserve moments of simple, intense humanity. Hands fumbling with straps on a cold deck, the smell of fuel in an open cockpit, the quick arithmetic of a navigator under searchlights, and the small private relief when a plane returns. Back in peacetime, those same men would visit museums where a surviving swordfish sits under glass and trace its ribs with a finger.
The plane becomes an icon of skill more than of technology. It is not the fastest, not the most elegant, but it was the instrument of a daring idea. We have reached the point where the first wave had struck, and the harbor, by design, was awash with light and sound. The initial strikes had produced visible results, and crews who remained in the sky were left with more choices than before: press an advantage, run the gauntlet again, or break off to preserve aircraft and men. Tension thickened as commanders on the carrier weighed immediate tactical gains against the imperative to conserve their scarce air group for future operations. The second wave, carrying the possibility of finishing what the first had started or of paying a heavier price, was still out over the dark water. It is in that suspended instant, the gap between the first and the second wave, that the raid's moral and operational questions begin to converge. How much risk do you accept to deepen an advantage? How do you measure success when loss is inevitable? The men who took off from Illustrious had no luxury of theoretical debate. Their calculus was immediate, brutal, and personal. For those on deck waiting, there was the thin, anxious ritual of watching for the glint of propeller lights on the horizon. For those who had attacked, there was the long, cold ride back across dark water and the knowledge that even a successful strike can leave a scar on the conscience. And if we look beyond that night to the ways these decisions are read afterwards, we begin to see Taranto as a hinge moment in professional naval thought. The raid showed, emphatically, that air power from carriers could reach into harbors and make battleships vulnerable where they believed themselves secure. For navies trained on the primacy of guns and armor, that was a jolt. For commanders who had been constrained by brittle arithmetic, not enough battleships, too many convoys, and overextended force, Taranto offered an alternative: use small, innovative means to shift the balance of power disproportionately. But this is also where historians remind us to measure influence carefully. Taranto's photographs informed discussions. They did not determine destiny. The raid was a powerful case study, not a magic key. The Italian fleet, while impaired, was not annihilated. The Mediterranean theater remained contested. In short, Taranto rewired assumptions. It did not alone win a war. As the second wave prepared to cross the distance back to Taranto, crews tightened straps, checked instruments, and readied themselves to fly again into a sky newly cleared by flares and gunfire. The men in those second sorties were not merely carrying torpedoes, they were carrying the weight of a doctrinal experiment. For the planners, for Cunningham and Lumley Lister, the next hours would either deepen the tactical success into a strategic opportunity or remind them of the peril inherent in such audacity.
At that moment of decision, the night still held secrets. The harbor had been struck, the first outcomes were visible in photographs, and yet the full tally of what it all meant, the human cost measured against the strategic gain, the way other navies would reinterpret these lessons, remained to be finalized. The raid had already demonstrated that an apparently obsolete aircraft, flown with skill and audacity, could alter the calculus of naval warfare. What remained was to see how that demonstration would ripple outward, into doctrine, into policy, and into the personal memory of those who had flown and waited. The engines of the remaining Swordfish thundered in the black. The second wave cut their engines briefly in the shadow of a cloud, then resumed as they stroked toward the faint line where land met sea. On Illustrious, sailors scanned the horizon for the first pale pinpricks that might be returning aircraft. In the surrounding darkness, men felt the weight of choices made on the balance of small instruments and human courage. The raid had begun as a question: can small means produce large effects? By the time the second wave reached the harbor, the question had already started to answer itself. But the final lines of that answer would need daylight, reconnaissance, and the patient work of counting damage and loss. In the half-light before dawn, the photographs would come. The pilots would write their entries, sometimes spare and sometimes raw. "Touched the surface once," John Neal wrote, a line that stands for more than the mechanics of flight. It is shorthand for proximity to death, for professional mastery under pressure, and for the strange intimacy of machines and men in war. But whether those lines would be read as the beginnings of a doctrinal revolution, a cautionary tale, or simply a night of brave improvisation depended on what came next: the second wave's fate, the aftermath of float and ashore, and the way navies and historians would carry the story forward. By first light, the evidence that mattered most had been gathered not in speeches, but in light and shadow, in the black and white frames of reconnaissance cameras. Those images removed the rhetoric and let iron speak. Decks that had been proud and level the night before were strewed with wreckage. Superstructures were canted and torn. Compartments were open to the Mediterranean. Sailors and officers ashore and afloat began the mundane, urgent tasks of damage control: shoring, pumping, improvising patches to keep warships from sliding beneath the waves. The operational language that followed was precise and unromantic. Which berths were hit, which pumps failed, which ships were beached deliberately to avoid deeper loss. The tally that mattered to commanders was equally prosaic. 3 major units were put out of action for a time. That count would feed strategy rooms, staff memos, and the quiet conversations of naval attachés in London, Rome, and Tokyo.
Admiral Cunningham's response was characteristically restrained and military in tone. He sent a signal that congratulated the crews while warning against triumphalism. For a hard-headed professional, the raid's tactical effect was welcome, but so too was the need to preserve a delicate advantage. There was no inflated propaganda about a sea change. Instead, there were orders and calculations. Vice Admiral Lumley Lister at his staff turned the immediate success into a set of contingency plans: how to exploit reduced Italian readiness, how to cover convoys to North Africa more effectively, and how to allocate aircraft and carriers for the months ahead. The raid had opened options. Turning them into lasting advantage required men and material the Royal Navy did not possess in abundance. For the men who had flown, the return to Illustrious was a mix of relief and exhaustion. The deck logs recorded arrivals and missing aircraft. The manifest recorded losses. 2 Swordfish never made it home. Their absence was a silence that could not be filled by reconnaissance photographs or dispatches. The comrades who remained carried their loss quietly, a name crossed from the roster, a small epitaph in a notebook, and those private gaps stitched themselves into the wider tapestry of the raid. War always refracts the technical and the mortal through the same lens. A successful strike and a man who did not come back are part of the same ledger. In the days that followed, every piece of evidence from Taranto was interrogated for lessons. Naval staff officers and doctrinal committees translated photographs into tactical diagrams. They measured arc and angle, calculated blast radii, and sketched approaches that might be safer or more effective in the future. Technical officers dissected the performance of the torpedoes and noted what had worked and what had failed: issues of depth keeping, the influence of shallow harbor bottoms, and the reliability of magnetic versus contact fuses. Engineers and ordnance officers discussed countermeasures. Booms and nets could stop some torpedoes, but the harbors of the world were varied and imperfect. In some cases, shallow water reduced torpedo performance. In others, anchorage patterns offered tragic proximity for a well-placed weapon. Outside the Admiralty, foreign observers filtered the facts through different doctrines and assumptions. Naval attachés took home prints and reports. A Japanese delegation recorded the photographs and cataloged the methods. Those images, simple, irrefutable, and visually dramatic, entered study folders, lecture halls, and war colleges. Taranto's chief lesson for many observers was not a single technical trick, but a conceptual shift. Aircraft operating from carriers could threaten capital ships in their supposed sanctuaries. That notion had been considered before, argued about in memos and at staff colleges. Taranto furnished concrete proof in the form of smoking decks,
and beached hulls.
It is easy, in hindsight, to let this notion balloon into deterministic cause and effect. Historians have cautioned against that error. Taranto did not make future events inevitable. It provided a demonstration that influenced minds, that qualified existing doubts, and that added a fresh data point to debates already in motion. The comparative history that followed the raid often surfaces a number that sears in memory: 21 aircraft at Taranto versus 177 at Pearl Harbor. That arithmetic is blunt but revealing. Taranto was an example of how a modest force, well-directed and daringly employed, could achieve decisive tactical effects. Pearl Harbor was a different scale and a different context entirely. Scholars who explore the relationship between the two events tend to emphasize multiplicity of causes. Japanese planners noted Taranto. They also examined many other factors: carrier doctrine, intelligence failures elsewhere, industrial capacities, and political imperatives, before choosing a course that led to the Pacific battles. Taranto's photographs were influential. They were not a single spark that set the Pacific ablaze. Within naval doctrine, the implications were more immediate. For navies clinging to the logic of armor and gun caliber, the raid forced a re-evaluation of assumptions. Armor and firepower remained important, no one was claiming otherwise, but the environment in which those qualities mattered had shifted. Ports, once thought safe behind booms and batteries, were shown to be vulnerable to the methodical, patient application of air power. Commanders began to ask different questions about where to anchor a fleet, how to distribute escorting assets, and how to prioritize repair yards and anti-aircraft defenses. The balance between passive protection, nets, booms, shore batteries, and active air cover was recalibrated in many navies. The endurance of Taranto as a case study lay in its clarity. A photograph or a short film strip could explain to an admiral more quickly than a memorandum why complacency in harbor could be fatal. Yet the raid's long-term strategic effects were inevitably conditioned by what came next. The Royal Navy could not, with ease, sustain a relentless campaign of harbor strikes across the Mediterranean without additional carriers, trained air crews, and logistical follow-through. Resource constraints meant that strategic opportunities had to be prioritized. The damage at Taranto did secure a window for better convoy protection and reduce the immediate threat to certain Allied sea lanes, but it did not translate into instant control of the Mediterranean. Axis and Allied naval power ebbed and flowed in subsequent months as new operations, land campaigns, and logistical bottlenecks reshaped the theater. The historiographical debate that surrounds Taranto is therefore sensible and necessary. Some historians argue that Taranto marked a doctrinal turning point, a demonstration that accelerated the acceptance of carrier-based air power as decisive against capital ships, and point to subsequent operations that followed its lessons. Others underscore the conditional nature of its effects, that Taranto's model required replication and resources to be strategically transformative, and that by itself it did not erase the material balance in the Mediterranean overnight. Both perspectives are compatible. Taranto both demonstrated capability and revealed limits. It showed what was possible. It also clarified what additional investments were necessary to make that possibility routine. Perhaps the most enduring portion of the story is the human one. Diaries, logbooks, and interviews preserve a texture of experience that refuses to be reduced to tactical diagrams. John Neal's terse line, "touched the surface once," has the economy of a naval log but the power of a tiny confession. Alfie Sutton's image of tracers bouncing along the water gives us a visual shorthand for an otherwise ineffable sensory world. Cold, vibration, the smell of oil, and the fragile balance between machine and man. Those fragments of memory are not merely sentimental color. They are primary sources that anchor interpretation. They remind us that doctrine is enacted by nervous hands and weary eyes, that decisions are made in the small, cramped spaces of cockpits, and that the noise of battle lodges itself in personal recollection long after the strategic debates have cooled. The material culture that remains, the silk maps with frayed edges, the brass dial of a course and speed calculator polished by years of use, the surviving swordfish itself, are conduits between past and present. At the Fleet Air Arm Museum and in private collections, curators and historians preserve these objects not as static relics, but as teaching tools. A silk map teaches you about navigation in a blackout. The brass calculator shows the real arithmetic involved in setting a heading over empty sea. Standing beside the swordfish in a hangar, you can appreciate how exposed the crews were, how raw the elements felt in an open cockpit, and how every small anatomical detail of the aircraft contributed to its wartime role. There is, too, the peculiar intimacy of handling an object once entrusted to a named person. A worn leather strap might carry a fingerprint impression.
A dented toggle switch might mark an urgent in-flight repair. These things turn an abstract operation into a human ledger, a roll call of gestures that collectively produce the rate. Curators can point to provenance with care. This map used by a particular squadron. This instrument noted in a logbook. Each artifact carries provenance that helps historians link material practice with documentary testimony. The last airworthy swordfish, preserved and maintained by enthusiasts and professionals, offers a final, living link.
To take that aircraft into the sky is not to replicate Taranto. Nothing could be, but to understand its behavior and limitations. The first time I climbed into the cockpit, the engine throbbed more than it hummed, and the entire machine felt like an instrument tuned to patience. The wind was immediate. It entered around the cockpit and reminded you in every gust that the crews of 1940 had been exposed in ways our enclosed, climate-controlled cockpits make us blissfully forget. Low-speed handling is not a theoretical concept when you feel the control sensitivity at 30 feet above the sea. It becomes a tactile fact. You understand in muscle and breath why a slow aircraft might be an asset for a torpedo run. You have more time to aim, a steadier platform for release, and the ability to hold a heading against buffeting. You also feel the vulnerability, the thin strip of obdurate metal and wood that separates you from the water. Flying the Swordfish today is reflective. It is an exercise in empathy more than nostalgia. The roar of the engine and the gulls that follow the shoreline are modern details. The fundamental impressions, the cold, the sky's emptiness, the need to trust instruments and a crewmate's calculation are continuous with 1940. Museums are custodians of that continuity. When visitors lay a hand on an aircraft strut or read a diary under glass, they participate in a conversation across time. That exchange is part of why Taranto endures in public memory. It is tangible, narratable, and teachable. The raid is not reduced to a single narrative of triumph. It lives in the knots of human action and in the objects those hands and heads used. We arrive, finally, back at the question posed at the outset. Why did this one night change military history? The answer is neither theatrical nor simple. Operation Judgment changed assumptions by proving concretely that carrier-borne air power could penetrate seemingly secure harbors and damage capital ships. It did so with a modest force, using a combination of audacity, careful reconnaissance, and painstaking navigation. That combination, obsolete equipment deployed intelligently against a specific problem set, is a recurring theme in military history. Advantage often accrues not to those with the newest hardware alone, but to those who match means to purpose. The raid's broader legacy is perhaps best understood as a shift in problem framing. Navies had to reckon with a different set of operational questions: where to base fleets, how to protect them in port, how to design harbors and defenses against aerial torpedoes, and how to prioritize carrier construction and aircrew training. Taranto supplied a vivid answer to those questions. It did not and could not resolve every strategic tension in the Mediterranean or beyond. It changed a portion of the toolkit and illustrated the sorts of investments necessary to wield that tool effectively.
Neither was Taranto the work of lone genius, nor the product of flawless machinery. It was improvisation within planning, risk wrapped in preparation, and audacity contained by navigation and calculation. It was men and machines operating under the pressure of time and the cold of the sea. Its greatest lesson is as practical as it is moral. Innovation thrives where necessity presses, and where people are willing to test an idea against danger. The evidence of that test, photographs, diaries, and the aircraft themselves, continues to teach us how decisions unfold in the moment. When you stand by the Swordfish in a museum, or read the smudged lines of a logbook, Taranto is neither a myth to be defended, nor a pedestal to be climbed. It becomes instead a case study in adaptation. For militaries, it remains a caution and an instruction. Do not overvalue your anchors. Do not assume sanctuary without examining the tools your adversary might use against you. For the public, it provides a human story. Young men navigating nights that were, in the end, arithmetic and courage braided together. The men who flew that night left behind concise, sometimes cryptic words. They recorded what they did, often with the professional terseness of naval life. They did not explain in ornate prose the doctrinal ripples their actions would cause. Historians, strategists, and museum curators assemble those fragments into a fuller picture, mindful always of proportion,
of not allowing a single photograph or a dramatic night raid to eclipse the many other forces at play in a vast conflict. Taranto's true change was subtle and practical. It nudged military thinking, it demonstrated capability, and it insisted that navies account for the reach of air. Operation Judgment remains, therefore, an extraordinary night not because it alone determined the course of the war, but because it showed how small, audacious means, applied with skill and careful planning, can unsettle great assumptions. Its legacy exists in doctrine, in the careful hands that maintained the last swordfish, and in a diary line that compresses danger and craft into 4 words: touched the surface once. That memory, preserved in ink and metal, teaches us about the cost and courage of innovation. If you want to see more on the objects, the maps, and the interviews that bring this story alive, there are linked resources and museum pages where primary documents and photographs are available for further study. For now, take a moment to imagine the fragility of that fabric skin against the Mediterranean night, and the quiet arithmetic that turned a biplane into a lever for strategy. Remember that history often turns on small hinges: a map folded in the dark, a brass dial rubbed smooth by fingers, and a decision to try something new in the face of hard odds.